the ways of our international norms and rules, all of them championing the ideology of the United States, again, as the sole superpower after the Cold War. Now, the thing is, when it comes to the Cold War, with its end, a lot of international relations scholars, along with geopoliticians, a lot of them saw what we call a crisis. And that crisis begs to answer the question of what happens next for world politics. What is next for our geopolitical eras? So that is the main question that is being looked at when we talk about New World Order geopolitics. What comes after the Cold War geopolitical era? Now, the reason why a lot of international relations scholars tend to ask that is because there has been this established knowledge before that a time of bipolarity, in this case the Cold War being a bipolar system, a time of bipolarity would lead us to stability. A time of bipolarity is considered the most stable era for international relations. And again, this is a working theory, all right? It's not an absolute truth when it comes to the interpretation of the world. But because back then they thought that the Cold War era and this bipolar world order, they thought it was a good thing. Because what we see there is that there are two superpowers within our world, and those two superpowers, they keep each other in check. All right? So, because they check each other's power, because they balance each other's power, then what happens is that there is some sort of predictable stability in our world. So that was the idea back then, that the Cold War meant stability, or bipolarity meant stability. But now, again, because what we see in our world is the collapse of the Cold War with the decline of the Soviet Union, we are stuck in this new kind of understanding. This understanding of a new geopolitical era where some of the Cold War geopolitical concepts felt like they were no longer useful. It was as if for the intellectuals, for the scholars, for the geopoliticians, what they saw was the end of the Cold War also meant that in our world, there is what we call a geopolitical vertigo. This geopolitical vertigo simply means that for a lot of the thinkers back then, there was this state of confusion. And this state of confusion, it's simply because the Cold War ended. And again, their understanding was the Cold War was the most stable system in place for us in our world. So this state of confusion, what we see here was the old understandings of the Cold War, they became redundant, and the new ones, the new kinds of concepts that we have for geopolitics, it hasn't been yet invented. It hasn't been yet issued or approved. So we did not have a concept of what comes next after the Cold War. So basically, this is where the confusion stands. This is where we see an uncertainty taking place in our world. We do not know what's going to happen next post Cold War. So, in simple terms, the geopolitical vertigo, this is the time where the world and its scholars, they were not ready to predict the end of the Cold War and what comes after. And because what we see here is this time of uncertainty, post Cold War, a lot of the governments, the intellectuals, the people, they saw the end of the Cold War as a threat because they saw this, number one, as an end to stability, and number two, they saw it as a beginning to disorder. And this was the initial idea of the post Cold War geopolitical landscape. And this is where we will start our understanding of the New World Order geopolitics. How we have not only come about to where we are today, but also the new ideas about our geopolitical spaces that were formed right after the Cold War. But again, the main question for New World Order geopolitics will always be what happens next for world politics. Again, coming from the Cold War without any idea of what would happen in place, that level of uncertainty, it begs the question of what happens next for world politics. All right, so how do we understand it? We start with understanding what really happened basically. So, what happened in terms of empirical evidence when it comes to the post Cold War geopolitics. Now, what we see is that basically the United States, they became the victor of the Cold War, right? And comes along with that, what we see would be the liberal capitalist ideology being the most dominant ideology in our world space. So, with that clear idea in mind, what we see is the United States as the sole superpower. It led to the US and its ideology being at the world's center of this quote unquote new world order after the Cold War. So the beginnings of this new world order, it starts with what we call a US centrality. Meaning to say that since the US is the sole superpower in our world, they are at the center of identifying what the new world order is. They have the capacity to create, they have the capacity to establish our new world order. And when it comes to that, we start with US President George H.W. Bush. And during his time post Cold War, Bush pronounced that this is a time of quote unquote uncertainty, unpredictability, instability, and chaos, as there are new threats in the world, according to him. And this uncertainty and this instability, it led to the idea that the new threats in our world would be the non-democracies that would rise. Those non-democracies would rise and they would become a threat to the new world order that the US was trying to create, wherein it would be at the center of world politics. So, because they were saying that there is these new threats in the world, again, non-democracies, those non-democracies, in order to respond to those potential chaos, in order to respond to those threats, the US under the Bush administration, they recognized the reality that they needed to commit to two things. The first one is they needed to prevent that threat. And in order to prevent that threat, it meant that the United States will be upholding the liberal international order building. Meaning to say that they will be the ones to lead the world order, and they would lead it by creating institutions, by creating organizations, and by creating a system that is driven by the liberal ideology. So that's the first one. The second one essentially is that for the US, it needed to bring that liberal order to the nations left out. So given that the US is at the center, it also meant that they wanted to export their liberal ideology. And this came at a time where democratization was happening. So the US trying to democratize a lot of the different countries. This is where we see that quote unquote bringing the liberal order to nations left out. So it's the US trying to build new institutions, new territories in its image, in its likeness, in terms of ideology and governance. And this is what we see for the United States post-Cold War. This is what they were trying to do. And one of the American foreign policies that served as basically evidence of that, bringing those who were left out, when it comes to the democratic realm of the United States, would be their response to the Gulf War during the time that the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait happened. So during this time, as you can see in the slide, so Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that led to an armed conflict between the Iraq and the United States, with the United States trying to support and democratize Kuwait during this time. So, given this trigger, this Gulf War, given this trigger, the United States, they found reason and they found a rationale to defining what the new world order is. And again, that New World Order is trying to set up a liberal international order while at the same time trying to democratize countries that are not under the realm of that liberal international order. So, this is where the United States again define a new world order. And because of that, they created this quote unquote unique responsibility to bring freedom globally. That they had to do a lot of the hard work, according to them, of bringing freedom to the rest of the globe. And this led to the legitimized US violent democratizations in a lot of territories, especially in the Middle East. And this is where we see the story set when it comes to the beginnings of the New World Order. Again, that idea that the United States was trying to uphold the liberal international order. And in order to do that, what they had to do was they had to democratize many territories, even through violent means. And we saw a lot of that happening in the Middle Eastern or the West Asian region. Now, the thing is, what justified that idea? What provided them legitimacy when it comes to that idea? We start our seminal text on the New World Order with Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. All right, so anyone familiar with Francis Fukuyama's The End of History? So it's a pretty interesting take. Wouldn't say perfect, but it's a pretty interesting take in our world. And basically, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, it legitimized and it described the U.S. attitudes when it comes to exporting its democracy or the U.S. process of democratization. So it's describing why there is this idea of why the U.S. is exporting its image, its likeness to other territories. And this is also in connection to the Bush administration's declaration of a new world order during the Gulf War in the 90s. So this was, or this text was an integral part of US strategy and political culture during this time. And during this time, what we see in Francis Fukuyama's argument is basically that according to him, the end of history would be the capitalist era. The end of history would be a place where we see capitalism thrive. And according to him, the reason why capitalism would be the end of history is because this is the time where everyone in society would be happy, would be content, that everyone in society would experience a prosperous life. So this is the argument of Francis Fukuyama, that the end of history would be capitalism. So why did he say that? He based it basically on the Hegelian dialectic, which if you remember, we discussed this during the imperialist geopolitical era. So we discussed the Hegelian dialectic there for a very short time. But basically, the dialectic theory, it involves a threefold stage of development, all right? So we start with our society. And our society has a status quo, all right? So everything in society is just the way it is, no changes. However, the more that we see imperfections in society, the more we see certain problems coming about in society, the more that we also realize that we needed to create changes. And in order to create those changes, what we needed to do was we needed an antithesis to the thesis, all right? So again, the status quo would be the thesis, and then the conflict would happen when the antithesis spurs those who are not content with the kind of society we have, those who want to bring about change in our society. That would be the antithesis. So, according to the Hegelian dialectic, which is not from Francis Fukuyama, something to disclose. The Hegelian dialectic is rooted from Marx's theory of history. However, Francis Fukuyama used it also as a form of explaining the end of history through capitalism. But yeah, again, according to the Hegelian dialectic, we start with the thesis, and that would conflict with the antithesis. All right, so that society and the ones who want to bring about change in that society, they would clash with each other, and then eventually that would result into a synthesis. And then that synthesis would be the new kind of society that would be brought upon the conflict of the thesis and the antithesis. But again, if society is not content with our society, then those who would want to change it would bring about another antithesis. So you would have the synthesis being in conflict with the antithesis, and that would bring about another synthesis in society, another new kind of society in place. However, again, if we are not content, we have another antithesis in place which would clash with each other until that would result into a new synthesis. And this will happen all over and all over again until we are content with society, aka the end of history, the end of this cycle, of this threefold stage of development. Now, that is the idea of the Hegelian dialectic. And applying it in our world, what we have seen is that we started out with basically an era of what we call primitive communism. So it's basically everyone living our own lives, living in the villages, not minding anyone else. It was a very unorganized society. All right? So, in that case, this unorganized society, they did not have anything basically. They were just living their lives. This was the status quo. Until eventually, we needed division of labor. There was this increase in private property. So that eventually led to an era of slavery. In this era of slavery, what we would see would be the slaves and the slave owners. So the slave owners and the slaves, they would clash with each other, and that would result in a new kind of society, the feudal state system. And then the feudal state system would have the landowners or the feudal lords and the serfs. And then together again, they would clash, and that would result into another era of our society, which is the imperialist era. So this is where we see the empires and the territories that they would conquer, and then again, clashing with each other, that would result into our idea of our era today, which is capitalism. However, as you all know, maybe a review from your INCLOS or maybe from your IS clubs, in terms of capitalism, again, we are divided into two classes, right? So the bourgeois democracy and then the proletariats, right? So the working class and the capitalists. So what we see here is that basically, again, supposedly according to Marx's theory of history, the bourgeoisie and the proletariats would clash with each other, and that would result to communism. And that is the end of history according to Karl Marx, communism. However, for Francis Fukuyama, again, he argues that capitalism is where we stop our history. That capitalism would be the end of history in our society. Now, the question there is, why is it that capitalism would be the end of history? Now, for Francis Fukuyama, he claims that capitalism would be the end of history simply because, again, as I mentioned a while ago, everyone is happy in a capitalist system, according to Fukuyama. Everyone is benefiting, everyone is looking at individual freedoms, everyone is able to self-determine, live lives freely, buy the things they want. So basically, everyone is happy in a capitalist society. That is what Francis Fukuyama argues. So, for him, he claims that in our world, we are witnessing this large expansion of liberal democracy. And this large expansion of liberal democracy and capitalism, it leads because of the US exceptionalism and American triumphalism. post-Cold War. That the US was the victor, it showed that it had the international role of bringing about this liberal world order in our system. And together with that, America's triumphalism shows that it is ready to become a role model that would export its version of democracy to other parts of the world. And again, Francis Fukuyama, he believes that this is the culmination of all historical progress. That the end of history is that point at which humanity, according to him, has actualized the universal truths first as expressed in the French Revolution. So these principles of liberty and equality. That according to him, these democratic values that the US is exporting, it's showing those signs of liberty, of freedom, and equality, of everyone having the freedom to get what they want, to be who they want to be. So that is the idea of what he thinks the setup of our world should be post-Cold War, and how that would end this continued struggle over ideas and principles throughout history. That everyone would be satisfied with the capitalist system. According to him, what he said is that eventually all countries would adopt this democratic liberal capitalist idea, because this is the era where, quote unquote, according to him, all prior contradictions are resolved and all human needs are satisfied. Again, in this capitalist era. So there is no struggle or conflict over large issues, and consequently, no need for generals and statesmen. What remains is primarily economic activity during this time. So this is the belief of Francis Fukuyama. And what we see here is that his belief was that given this idea that everyone is happy, everyone is satisfied, we no longer have conflict. We primarily look at economic activity. That means that the actual existing political democracy and capitalist neoliberalism of the US, along with the models followed by Europe, North America, it represents what we call the vanguard of civilization, the highest point of society, which is why he believes that this is the culmination of human history. All right? So, this is what Francis Fukuyama believes in. Now, the question for the class is, do you agree with the sentiments of Francis Fukuyama? Do you think that his arguments are something that resonates with you? Or do you think you feel like there's a difference with what he argues versus what the realities are? Do you agree with Francis Fukuyama's arguments when it comes to his article, The End of History? Anyone? Do you agree? Do you disagree when it comes to Francis Fukuyama's end of history argument? No idea whether Francis Fukuyama makes sense. One of your classmates in the meeting chat said, not really po kasi as we can see right now, may conflicts pa rin po. Alright, that makes sense, right? That one thing about Francis Fukuyama's argument is that he said that we are experiencing the end of history in this current lifetime because there is no struggle or conflict over quote unquote large issues, right? However, what we see up until today is that yes, wars are more manageable as compared to as before, However, it doesn't necessarily mean that these wars are leading people to much happier lives or that everyone is satisfied with what they have, right? So that is one argument that you can make. Another one said it's still primarily idealistic about the positive impact capitalism has done to global society as a whole. But the reality we face today seems to be still riddled with issues, more or less so, about the marginalized sectors. In conclusion, the Hegelian dialectic would still make sense in this regard. So, yeah, if you look at it right, the Hegelian dialectic makes sense. However, Francis Fukuyama's argument, especially that the end of history is within this capitalist era, it seems like it's too idealistic, as your classmate mentioned, that it seems to have a too optimistic viewpoint of history, right? That he assumes that everyone is satisfied, everyone is happy when it comes to this capitalist system. But it is true that up until today, we still see certain sectors in our world, certain groups of people still being marginalized. So, how is it that everyone is prioritized or that all human needs are satisfied? If we look at the empirical evidence today, that's not necessarily the case, right? So that's another way that we can view critiquing Francis Fukuyama's argument. Another one said that, yes, I also see the end of history uh, being the Cold War. It's because people have now all the ability to be free. The ordinary people is now tasting the bare minimum. One thing about this era, there will always be big guys that gets more, but everyone, ordinary people, also have a taste of a version of free and rich. So again, this sounds like the idea of what the capitalist era promises, or what the U.S. brand of capitalism and liberal democracies try to establish in all the other parts of the world. Now, the question there is that, again, it makes sense, right? That everyone seems to have relatively better lives as compared to before, as compared to the times of war, right? There seems to be this priority of economic development over political conflict, right? So we see that coming into play. And when we see those things, it gives us perspective that yes, we are in a better situation as compared to as before. But we also have to recognize, right, that not all of Francis Fukuyama's arguments really make sense for every kind of people, right? As mentioned here by your classmate, there will always be quote unquote big guys that gets more. Now, um, if that is the case, then that usually results in further marginalization, right? In further concentration of wealth, let's say, to only a few. While at the same time, it also shows how much more we need to progress as a society when it comes to addressing that issue, right? So when it comes to this, what we can see is that there are some real valuable and valid thoughts coming from Francis Fukuyama, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of his arguments, especially the entirety of how the US would be the standard bearer that would export democracy to others, it doesn't really make sense for us to completely follow, right? What the US and its brand of democracy is. Another one of your classmates said, I feel like his argument that capitalism is the end goal, where everyone would be satisfied and prosperous, shows a completely different reality from what we have right now in an inarguably capitalist society. So, yes, we recognize, right, that we are in this capitalist society. Just now, the disparity between the rich makes hard for poor people to even just get by, which is a large issue as in capitalism free trade makes. It's so the rich do the most they can to keep the richest to themselves, which could lead to more conflict. All right. So again, right, putting it into perspective, We do not have as worse problems as during times of war. It's true, right? We do not fear exactly that idea that tomorrow we might not live. We do not have those things. That we do not have the fear that one day we would be struck by missiles. We do not have those kinds of problems within our own society. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those things do not happen in other parts of society, right? Imagine, just yesterday yon, meron na namang airstrikes within the Gaza Strip, right? So what we are seeing is that there are still large problems. Not everyone is enjoying what the promise of Fukuyama is, right? That there are still a large amount of problems. They're just economic, or they're just more economic when it comes to its angle or its structure, right? Again, that huge global wealth inequality is a real big problem for all of us. So that is overall a large issue. Again, going to the global level nga right? So what you can see is it's a large issue. So how can you say that it's not something that we can consider as a problem, right? So yeah, another one of your classmates said, Francis Fukuyama assumes that no other great transformative force would arise in the future to challenge the status quo. Excellent argument. So, your classmate further says that it's short-sighted to assume that capitalism is the end, because who are we to assume that nothing else will succeed capitalism or any current economic system for that matter? It also conflicts with technological determinism, that is technology that also drives human society in its own capacity in ways that institutions cannot always preempt. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy to assume that people will simply solve problems until there's nothing left, because it assumes a static set of problems that won't compound or change. Ironically, the idea of an end of history assumes that history has already came to a halt, and all that has to happen is for the holes to be patched. Centuries from now, we will be talking about capitalism and socialism the same way we talk about mercantilism and feudalism. That is a possibility, right? So what we see here is that, again, this is a very hasty generalization, at the same time a very flawed simplification for Francis Fukuyama's end, right? And that, again, who knows what society brings in the future, right? There always comes a time where change will happen. It can be fast, it can be slow, but what we know is that change works in increments in society, right? That change continually happens the more that societies and all of its actors continually work in this earth, right? So, coming from that argument, what we see is that for Francis Fukuyama, he tends to put a halt in the possible changes in our world. And again, this is a very hasty generalization on his part, thinking that change can happen, thinking that change, or rather, cannot happen, or that history really relies on how capitalism would be. Again, their argument is the pinnacle of society. All right. So another one of your classmates said, capitalism may have granted many people's freedoms more than in the past, but it's hard to see how it will bring satisfaction to all when many people below the poverty line struggle to keep themselves and their families fed and accounted for. All right, so again, what we see here is that the sense of Francis Fukuyama's article, it doesn't necessarily reflect the empirical evidence or our contemporary realities, right? That there are still a lot of problems that we as a society face. So, if a lot of us realize that the arguments of Francis Fukuyama doesn't really make any sense when it comes to our realities, or that it's not congruent to the kinds of realities we know now, then why is it that the end of history matters? Why is it that the end of history was put forward by Francis Fukuyama? What makes him argue this? Now, the thing is, when we look at Francis Fukuyama's background, it comes from still a very not a Eurocentric, but a US-centric rather. It comes from a very US-centric lens. All right? For Francis Fukuyama, talking about his history, for a long time he has worked with the American government. So before he worked for the Reagan administration, and then he also worked in a Cold War think tank. If you're familiar with the RAND Corporation, RAND, so the RAND Corporation. So he worked a lot in the Cold War geopolitical era. At the same time, he was also able to work in this new world era geopolitics during the time of the Bush administration. So during the Bush administration, he was the deputy director for policy planning. So what we can see here is that he really comes from the side of the US government. He really comes from the side of American foreign policy, which is why he really pushes for, again, that idea of US exceptionalism, where the US, again, has a global role to promote this liberal, democratic, capitalist ideology. This is where we see the ideas coming into fruition for the US, using that idea or arguments coming from Fukuyama in order to legitimize that push for everyone to become a democracy. Because again, the selling point there is you need to be a democracy to enjoy your life. You need to be a democracy in order for your needs to be satisfied. You do not want to struggle. You do not want conflict. You want to enjoy life. You want to focus on freedom, whether that be individual freedoms or freedom from any oppressor. Choose democracy. That is basically what the end of history's purpose is. It's to market and endorse democracy. It's for the United States to have a platform, an agreeable platform for a lot of people, that is, to adopt these democratic capitalist ideals. So, if that is the case, then for Francis Fukuyama, his viewpoint of our world, it still falls under what concept? It falls from that idea of him believing on absolute truths, on objective views of the world, right? So where does that fall in? That for Francis Fukuyama, he still has what? Again, believing that his arguments are truths, absolute truths, or objective truths about our world. He falls into what? What concept, if you can remember, that viewpoint that they think what they argue is the absolute truth, the objective truths about our world? What concept is that? That Francis Fukuyama falls under the trap of which concept? Anyone? It's the God's eye view, right? Exactly. So yeah, for Francis Fukuyama, he again falls under that God's eye view. He still adopts arguments that he thinks are objective truths. He thinks that he's adopting this divine view of the world, thinking that his arguments would be the ideas um, that would dominate the conversation of New World Order geopolitics. Now, the thing is, he really did fall in that God's eye view. And the thing about it is, he fell into that God's eye view. And again, this is coming from his bias, right? Of being Eurocentric, US centric rather. But at the same time, this article, this the end of history article, it's so powerful during that time that it was so sensationalized. It was so sensationalized that, again, imagine we were talking a while ago that this was a way to market democracy. And it worked. It was so sensationalized that a lot of people believed in this philosophy, that a lot really quoted the term that we are at the end of history post Cold War. However, again, based on your arguments a while ago, what we can see is that yes, it is sensationalized and for all the wrong reasons. Because the article, it's an idealized self-understanding of the world in order to just again legitimate democratization and to justify this status quo that the US wants to push for in our world. So what we can see here is that their main use is to promote the Western liberal ideology and to promote the belief that in our world, the West is the best. That is the idea. That again, Francis Fukuyama, he sensationalized this article so much that it sent the idea that for our world, the end of history really is capitalism. That the West has achieved this consummation of history. That the West fulfilled human historical destiny by being the pinnacle of society, by being, as we said a while ago, the vanguard of civilization. However, again, it's all under the guise of promoting the West being the best. All other states are supposedly struggling to attain this pinnacle of society, of societal perfection, which the West has reached, which the Western European and the Northern American models of political democracy and capitalist neoliberalism has reached. So, if you want to achieve that pinnacle of society, you had to be a democracy. You have to follow what the US is doing. So this Francis Fukuyama article, it legitimized the actions, the ideology, the belief system of the United States. That is the reason why Francis Fukuyama's The End of History matters for New World Order geopolitics. But again, what we see here is that when we think about it more, it's still subject to a lot of critique, right? That again, it has hasty rather generalizations. It has a very flawed simplification of understanding our world. The first flaw of Francis Fukuyama's End of History is that again, it discounts the different places in our world. That in our world there is geographical uniqueness. And this geographical uniqueness, it's overridden by this idealized universals that they think democracy is applicable to all. That they think that democracy fits every kind of culture. But as we all know, that's not necessarily the case. If we look at our world right now, the highest forms of democracies rather, are usually the ones from the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries, right? However, even the US itself, the standard bearer of the brand of democracy that they want to push forth in our world, they are considered a flawed democracy. And a lot of our countries right now, they are considered flawed democracies. So what we see here is that again, if our democracy is flawed, how much reliable is it actually when adopted, right? How much flaws are there for us to ignore before we realize that this is not the pinnacle of society? That in our world, they just use this in order to still push for Western philosophical ideas. That if you do not commit to this, you're considered a historical society. However, if you follow the likeness, the image of the West, then you as a society is post-historical. You go beyond history. You achieve that consummation of historical society. So the end of history thesis or the end of history argument, it certainly does not mark the beginning of geography in a new era, but rather it just legitimized the United States actions. Another thing that's wrong with it is that, again, the West is best. That tagline in itself, it's completely ethnocentric. That what we see here is that there is this idea of the quote unquote the liberal, but it doesn't really tell us what this liberal is. However, if we understand what liberal is, it's basically us following the shape, the idea, the mold of the West. It's us being pushed to become similar to the Western versions. So to assume that modernity is represented by the United States, the European countries, it just goes to show that it's dangerously naive for us to identify copying them. Because again, that doesn't really mean that it would fit every culture, every form of society. That society should have their own self-determination on how they can best govern their own countries, right? So if that is the case, then what we see overall is that for Fukuyama, his assumptions that the Cold War led to the decline of communism as an ideology, and again, the supposed spread of liberalism, it led to that idea of a receding international conflict. However, what we see is that it's too optimistic, or as your classmate said, it's too idealistic. That this idea, it leads us to seeing our world in this very rose-tinted lens. It's not necessarily true that everyone is enjoying the capitalist society. That conflicts are still present, as you have mentioned a while ago. What we all see is that in our world, there are less wars, or that wars are more manageable, and that there is this growing concern for common marketization. That everyone has that idea of looking at economics now rather than politics. That is something that we see. However, again, the promise of Francis Fukuyama, it's very idealistic. It's very problematic. All right? So, any questions when it comes to Francis Fukuyama's The End of History? Any questions or clarifications? If none, can I get a thumbs up? All right. So, now, the thing is, again, we understand that there is still a reason why the end of history matters. Because again, it legitimized the US democratization model, right? Because it marketed the United States as a legitimate entity to export its version of democracy, and at the same time, it's seen as the role model of democracy because, again, during this time, it's the sole superpower. And who wouldn't want to be in the image and likeness of the sole superpower? The richest economy, the most powerful country, right? So, they had the capacity to become the role model, to become the legitimate standard bearer of the kind of democracy that they want to push in our world system. Now, that is the importance of Francis Fukuyama. However, what we see is that again, we are still not able to answer what happens next after Cold War geopolitics, right? What we are just seeing is what the US is doing. Now, another way to look at what the US is doing in order for us to completely understand New World Order geopolitics from the perspective of US centrality is again going back to the leader of the United States. So we go back to the view of George H.W. Bush. All right, so this is where we return in order to understand really what the United States tries to promote as a form of New World Order geopolitics. And because again, the New World Order geopolitics comes from George H.W. Bush. All right, so going back to our discussion a while ago on the Gulf War, again, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, what we saw was the United States, they supported Kuwait and they came into conflict with Iraq. And that led to the thinking of George H.W. Bush that in our world, there should be a quote unquote new world order that is beyond the ideological competition of the Cold War. And he formulated this in cooperation with Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush, they met each other in Helsinki. And that led to the 1990 Helsinki Summit. In the 1990 Helsinki Summit, they wanted to conceptualize a new era in our world. And the way that they described it, this new era, it should be, quote unquote, free from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace. This should be an era in which the nations of the world, East and West, North and South, can prosper and live in harmony. So that is their idea or their concept of what the new era should be. Now, to further strengthen this rhetoric of George H.W. Bush, he also said in his 1991 State of the Union speech that in our world, he believes that America was humanity's best hope in order to achieve what was said in the Helsinki summit. That America was the country, or the best country for that matter, that could help when it comes to freeing everyone from the threat of terror. That the United States is the humanity's best hope to pursue justice, to pursue peace, to live in a world of harmony. So again, that is the idea of his 1991 State of the Union speech. There he said that the hopes of humanity turn to us. We are Americans. We have a unique responsibility to do the hard work of freedom. That is what George H.W. Bush said. So, this is where we see this new world order we are in when it comes to the post-Cold War geopolitical era. This new world for Bush, it was a world where the United States and all the alliances of the United States, as long as they are willing to follow the United States, this is where the United States started to do the ordering. This is where the United States tried to formulate a new world order. And this world order, it's on the basis of the United States protecting others from, again, those non-democracies. Specifically, the non-democracies in the Middle East, right? So, again, the guys here is that the United States, they will protect you in order to assure that you are free from the threat of terror, that you have a peaceful life, that you live in a prosperous and harmonious society. So that is the belief of the United States. And again, any changes in that status quo of the United States, anything that is unfavorable for the United States, anything that is unfavorable for the interest of the West, for example, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, then those kinds of actions, they would be considered unlawful aggression. And that unlawful aggression, that is something that the United States would not stand for. That is something that they would go against. That you would be treated as an enemy if you do things that are unfavorable for the United States and their interests. So that is their take on that. And by contrast, what we see is that when it comes to any changes in the political, or rather geopolitical order, if there are any changes in the existing geopolitical order, however, if it's initiated by the United States or if it's favorable to the United States, then they would consider it as acceptable. They would consider it as necessary. If the status quo changes because of the United States, or if it changes because it's favorable to their interest, then they think that it was a necessary progress, that it's an acceptable change in the status quo. So that is by contrast what they believe in. So again, this is where we see the new world order taking place. For the United States, if you go against their interest, their ideology, then you are considered an enemy. Whereas if you align with them, or if it serves their interest, then they will consider it as something that is acceptable. And this is again central to the Bush's vision of a new world order. This is where we see that American interests, they became universal, meaning to say that the interest of America means it's the interest of the whole world. So that is where we see America's interests becoming universal interests. That they believe, or that Bush believed, that for America's interest, it was also the interests and aspirations for everyone. So again, the United States, they had to do everything in order to fulfill everyone's interests and aspirations. And everyone who would become a hindrance to that would be considered an enemy or an adversary. All right? So, this is the viewpoint of what the New World Order is according to George H.W. Bush. All right? So, if that is the case, the question here is, how would you describe this US foreign policy? How would you describe the viewpoint of Bush? If that is what he believes in, how would you describe it? Anyone? How would you describe US foreign policy if that is the case? Again, the case is the United States, they push for everyone's interests, quote unquote, their interest is everyone's interests. So they push for it, and if you agree with it, then that is acceptable and necessary. However, if you go against it, you are treated as an enemy. So the question there is, how would you describe US foreign policy? Anyone? How do we describe foreign policy here? It's very reminiscent po for me ng white man's burden. It's true, right? That the US, again, it's called American exceptionalism, right? The US exceptionalism, it leans more towards the United States becoming more interventionist at the guise of they're trying to protect the ideals that everyone aspires for, right? So there is that idea of the US having that quote unquote moral responsibility to help others to become a part of that pinnacle of society, right? So yeah, anyone else? How do we describe, or what can we say about US foreign policy? Anyone? Another one said, reminiscent of America's manifest destiny and interventionism. So yes, again, it's the belief that America has to take the realms in order to push, or in order to create change that is suited for the world, right? That they have this idea, and that it should be an idea that benefits everyone. However, again, given that idea, what we see is that it also justified even violent interventionism in other countries. And they've been doing that since the Roosevelt Corollary, right? Anyone else? So, yes, anything that we can argue about the kind of foreign policy that the US currently has in this era, if that is again the viewpoint of the United States. Anything else that you can observe when it comes to the US foreign policy if you think about it? What do you think is ironic with the New World Order geopolitical concepts of George H.W. Bush? Because if you think about it, there's something ironic about New World Order geopolitics from the viewpoint of the United States. What could it be that is ironic with New World Order geopolitics from the viewpoint of the United States? Anyone? They're doing what the communists were supposedly doing, that was taking over the world to make it communist. All right. That's something that we can see, right? Think all right, everyone, think about it based on the answer of your classmate. They're doing what the communists were supposedly doing, that was taking over the world to make it communist. However, in this sense, it's to push for that democratic liberal capitalist ideology, right? Now, think about it. What is ironic with the New World Order geopolitics, given the context that, again, number one, the United States is pushing for the democratic ideology, and that they believe that the democratic ideology would be the identity or the system that would help provide peace, freedom from terror, prosperous and happy lives for the people. So they're pushing it for the sake of everyone being progressive. That is the first, right? The second one is that anyone who goes against this democratic ideology of the United States, this again, democratic liberal capitalist ideology, all the same, if they push for it, or rather, if they go against it, then they are treated as an enemy. And usually, in this sense, who did they treat as an enemy? The non-democracies. Specifically, the non-democracies in the Middle East, right? And then the third thing is that, again, they try to push for democratization. That they intervene in different territories in order to, quote unquote, set them free, in order to democratize them. So, this is, according to George H.W. Bush, what the US has to do, right? Now, what is ironic with what they're doing in terms of New World Order geopolitics? One of your classmates said, New World Order geopolitics questions what will happen next for world politics. But it seems as if America is already imposing said future by US desires and goals for domination by interventionism and goodwill. That is true, right? That they are doing things in order to expand their ideology by intervening towards others. That desire, that goals for domination, it's by using democracy, right? So, again, that begs the question, what is ironic in New World Order geopolitics? That the US sees itself as the protector of nations in this constructed new world? I mean, they've been doing that since before, right? The US becoming more interventionist, the US saying they're trying to protect others, the US saying that they are the policeman, they're willing to engage in more peaceful means. However, if they need to move unilaterally with force, they will do it, right? They've been saying that since before. But again, what's ironic here? New World Order geopolitics, again, think about it. Think about it. New World Order geopolitics is the US trying to impose democracies or that democratic liberal capitalist ideology. Number two, it's the US versus non-democracies, right? So if you are aligned with the US, that's good. You are pro-peace, pro-free of terror, pro-prosperity, and pro-harmony. If not, then you are an enemy. You are a non-democracy. And they saw this under the guise of the Middle East, right? And then the third one is we will push for democratization. We will push for intervention in order for others to become a democracy. What is ironic here? Expanding their ideology, having an enemy that is non-democratic, intervening in others in order to become democratic. What do we see here? What do we see in the actions of the United States? An Americanized Zhdanov and Brezhnev doctrine. They already have that, remember? They have the Truman Doctrine and the George Kennan X article. So they have their own version of that. What's ironic here? You're already there. Nandyan na kayo lahat ng sinasagot nyo. Now, what's wrong there? Maybe the question is, why do you keep referencing the Cold War geopolitical concepts? It's ironic and hypocritical since it's obvious that they're doing this out of their want for global dominance. They've been doing this since imperial geopolitics, right? But again, the question is, when it comes to all your answers, why do you always root to Cold War geopolitics as concepts? Why is it always that you answer that it's ironic because there's this Americanized Zhdanov and Brezhnev doctrine that New World Order geopolitics is about interventionism, that they're doing what the communists were supposedly doing. So, why do you keep referencing the Cold War geopolitical era when we are in the New World geopolitical era? There was no Soviet Union left, but they simply couldn't shake this reality. They had to redirect it towards something else. That's true, right? So they redirected it to the Middle East, the non-democracies of the Middle East, right? So, what was the United States doing? Why do we keep on referencing Cold War geopolitics? Why is the US still stuck in this idea of we have an enemy? The irony here simply is that, anyone? Why is it that we keep on referencing Cold War geopolitics? Why is the US referencing our world as a US versus them situation? Them being, again, non-democracies. What do we see here? Simply that the irony of the New World Order geopolitics is that it's just a repetition of Cold War geopolitics. Understood? Think about it, right? Again, the United States is pushing for democracy, for capitalist liberalist ideologies, which they were already doing during the Cold War geopolitical era. Another thing, they were democratizing countries through interventionism. They were doing it during this time. However, they were also doing it in the Cold War geopolitical era. And then again, the Cold War geopolitical era saw the United States and their ideology versus the communist ideology of the USSR. In the New World Order, as mentioned by your classmate, yes, there's no Soviet Union anymore. However, the United States found a way to find or to identify another enemy, another combative binary of the United States in the form of the non-democracies of the Middle East. So basically, for George H.W. Bush's belief of the New World Order, it's a repetition of the Cold War concept. That is the irony there. We're saying that it's a New World Order. However, what we see there is that it's just a redundancy of the Cold War strategies of the United States. It's the same concept but with different fonts. That is the irony of New World Order geopolitics. Understood? That, again, what they are doing, it doesn't seem different from what they were doing before when it comes to Cold War geopolitics. The only difference is that they have a new enemy. They have a new adversary in this New World Order. The foreign policy of the United States, it rationalizes their attack versus Iraq because the war that they fought in, it guaranteed Western access to those non-democracies. They wanted to restore an anti-democratic but pro-Western institution within those Middle Eastern countries. So again, it's a different playing field, but they're playing the same game. It's still very Cold War geopolitics. The only difference is that America was the sole remaining power, a power without the check of any serious rival superpower. So they can do whatever they want. They have the ability for dominance, for hegemony. Because again, they are the only superpowers in place. But the way they play the geopolitical playing field, they're doing the same things that they were doing during the Cold War. That their strategy, they call it New World Order, but the rhetoric there is just the same. The strategy there is just the same, right? And again, kindly remember, this is the irony of New World Order geopolitics from the viewpoint of the United States. That it's just the same as before, they're only using different terms. They're only using different things as concepts, all right? But overall, what we see here is that, again, Cold War geopolitics, we have moved on from it, but clearly, the United States in their New World Order, they have not moved on from Cold War geopolitics and from the Cold War mechanism that happened. So if we were to answer today in our discussion, what happens next post-Cold War, what we are seeing from the viewpoint of US centrality is that for the US viewpoint, it's still the same thing. That they are finding enemies versus them that could relate to how they compete for global dominance. That they try to continually relieve this idea of Cold War geopolitics. However, they're using new names, they're using new concepts, the more that we progress throughout history. All right? Are we clear with our lesson for today? If yes, can I get a thumbs up? All right. So, we'll talk more about that idea that the New World Order geopolitics is just a repetition of Cold War geopolitics from the viewpoint of the United States. All right. We'll talk more about that by discussing Timothy Luke's The Discipline of Security Studies and the Codes of Containment, Learning from Kuwait, an article from 1991. All right. So, with that, some reminders. Uh, First, please kindly read the readings. Again, I've been reminding you to read the readings. So kindly read Timothy Luke's The Discipline of Security Studies and the Codes of Containment. Also, kindly read Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. All right, so those are the two supplementary texts that we will discuss next meeting on Thursday online. All right, so with that, we'll continue our discussion on New World Order geopolitics this coming Thursday,